Welcome to my YouTube channel, Heartbreak Chronicles, a place where you will hear a large number of fascinating and intriguing chronicles about hearts that are completely broken by female betrayal. Let's not drag on for long. Let's get straight to the point. 24 hours to get revenge. I always thought I had complete control over my life. I worked in the intelligence services, resolved the most difficult conflicts, forced the most dangerous people to lay down their weapons just by words. The most important thing in my job was to understand human nature. The ability to read body language, recognize lies, predict the enemy's next move. But one thing I could never have predicted was that betrayal would come from within my immediate circle. From home. I lived in a suburb of Chicago, in a large house that seemed perfect for our family. 10 years of marriage, a stable career, prosperity. My life was supposed to look like the billboards about the American dream. But this dream was an illusion. Over the past few months, I had noticed changes in Hannah's behavior. She had become colder, more distant. Her phone was always nearby, even when she just went to the kitchen to drink water. She started to stay late for bachelorette parties, which she had almost never had before. And every time I asked her about it, she would answer with a smile, "It doesn't matter to you, does it?" At first I didn't pay attention. I worked day and night, constantly on the road, and I thought I was just missing something important. But then, everything changed one evening. I came home early from work and heard her talking on the phone in the kitchen. Her voice was muffled, but I clearly heard the words, "You have no idea how soon everything will change. Just a little longer. He won't suspect anything." I pretended not to hear anything, but in my head I was already putting the puzzle together. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Years of work had taught me, no evidence, no accusation. So I decided to act methodically. As always, I had a security system in my house, but I didn't install hidden cameras in the bedroom. Someone else did. I found it by accident when I was checking one of the motion detectors. The camera was well disguised in a picture frame. It wasn't part of my security system. That made me suspicious. Who had installed it? And why? I logged into the hack and accessed the recordings. The recordings were stored on a local server. I opened the most recent files. The date was yesterday. The time was late in the evening. I pressed play. A familiar bedroom appeared on the screen. My bed. My wife. But I wasn't next to her. Josh. My little brother. I froze. They were hugging. Laughing. They looked like they were used to this. Like it had been going on for a long time. Couldn't breathe. My mind refused to accept it. It wasn't just a blow. This was betrayal at its deepest level. But the worst was yet to come. I rewound the recording a little. "He doesn't suspect anything?" Josh asked. "You know him," Hannah laughed. "He still thinks he's in control. So you're ready? It's all according to plan. We'll get what we need soon." My skin broke out in a cold sweat. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a plan. They weren't just sleeping together. They were getting ready to get rid of me. I didn't know the details yet, but something told me it was about money. Or maybe an insurance policy. Maybe they wanted to get rid of me. These two people I loved, trusted, and sacrificed for were plotting something terrible behind my back. I felt anger rising inside me, but it wasn't chaotic, uncontrolled anger. It was cold, measured rage that I had worked for years to keep my emotions in check. And now they would be my weapon. Did they want a game? Okay, now we'll play by my rules. I couldn't act on impulse. This wasn't something that could be solved. It was personal and at the same time deadly serious. I knew what I had to do. They thought they were in control. They thought I didn't know anything. But now I had the upper hand. I started recording from the server to several external media. I uploaded everything to a secure cloud storage. If anything happened to me, the right people would see these files. The next step was preparation. I locked myself in my office and made a plan. 24 hours. That was all I was going to give them. I had to set everything up so they wouldn't even realize what was happening until it was too late. The next night I got home early. Hannah was making dinner. Josh was here too, which was strange, because he didn't come in unannounced. "Hey bro," Josh smiled. "You're early today. I forced myself to smile back. It's just that the work wasn't very intense. That's good. Hannah came over, hugged me, and kissed me on the cheek. I almost flinched. Do you mind if we relax a bit today? I asked. I have a bottle of good whiskey. Oh, that's a great idea, Josh said, licking his lips. I took out the bottle and poured it for them both. They drank it in one gulp. After 10 minutes, Josh started to slouch. 5 more minutes later, Hannah. They were unconscious. I stood over them, watching them lie helpless. The game has begun, I whispered, and headed for the basement. Frank doesn't just want an explanation. He wants them to feel the fear he's experienced. He has exactly 24 hours to make them confess everything. But what if he learns even more terrible secrets? I've always thought I had complete control over my life. I've worked in intelligence agencies, resolved the most difficult conflicts, forced the most dangerous people to lay down their weapons with just words. In my job, the most important thing was understanding human nature. The ability to read body language, recognize lies, anticipate the enemy's next move. But one thing I could never have predicted was that the betrayal would come from within my immediate circle. From home. Frank stared at the 2 motionless figures lying on the cold concrete floor of the basement. He inhaled and exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain cool. The anger was hot, searing, but he knew that now he needed reason, not emotion. The room they were in had been set up years ago. He had used it for training, for analyzing the psychological profiles of criminals, for discussing tactics. Now it was the perfect place to find out the truth. Frank leaned over and checked their pulse. Alive. His specially selected dose of sleeping pills had done its job. They were unconscious, but they would wake up in an hour or so. That was enough time to prepare. Hannah woke first. She tried to move, but quickly realized that her wrists were tied to a metal chair. She jerked sharply, her eyes flashing. Frank! What the hell are you doing? She jerked, but the shackles didn't give her a chance. Josh was also starting to come to. He groaned, slowly opening his eyes. He looked miserable. What's going on? He muttered, his head leaning forward. Frank watched them calmly. He knew that the first thing they would feel was panic. They didn't yet realize the full extent of the situation they were in. You both betrayed me. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. And now you have exactly 24 hours to convince me to let you live. There was dead silence. Hannah froze, her face turning white. Josh didn't seem to know if this was a joke or not. Are you crazy? Hannah finally whispered. This isn't funny, Frank. Frank leaned closer and their eyes met. I guess I'm the one who decides what's funny and what's not. Frank knew that panic would eventually force them to talk. He took his time. They hadn't yet realized the full horror of their situation. I know about you, he said quietly. I saw everything. This isn't true, Josh stammered, his voice shaking. Frank pulled out his phone, opened the video and pressed play. It appeared on the screen. They're kissing, they're laughing, their secret conversations. Josh flinched and Hannah looked away sharply. This is just the beginning, Frank said. I know what you were planning, but now you have a chance to tell me everything yourself. Josh choked. It's not what you think it is. Then explain what it is? Frank interrupted. Hannah was silent. Her eyes were flashing, but her fear betrayed her more than any words. Okay. Frank stood up. If you don't want to talk now, we still have 24 hours. He turned and headed for the door, leaving them alone in the dark basement. He went back to his office and watched the other videos. In one of them, he saw Hannah talking on the phone to someone else. It's him, she said. It'll be ready soon. Frank wondered. If it was just a betrayal, why would she say something like that? Maybe there was a third player in this game. He went back to the basement. Hannah. Who else is involved in this? Nobody. She snapped her head up. That's between us. Frank laughed. He turned on the recording and brought the phone closer to her face. You were talking to someone. Who is it? She pursed her lips. Josh looked even more confused. Hannah? He whispered. What is he talking about? "Shut up, Josh," she snapped. Frank smiled. They were starting to break. Frank knew the next step was to take. He untied Josh and threw the knife in front of him. "You have a choice, brother. Either you tell me everything you know, or—" Josh stared at him. "You can't do this." "I can do anything," Frank replied calmly. "And you know it." Josh gasped. "It wasn't my idea." "Then whose idea was it?" Frank pressed. "He made us. He said it was the only way out." Josh covered his face with his hands. Frank inhaled. "Who?" "I don't know his name. He just called and gave instructions." Frank stared at him. It was even more complicated than he'd thought. The game wasn't even close to over yet. Frank stood still, pondering Josh's words. He saw lies, read them in people's eyes, heard them in their voices. But this time it was the truth. Josh really didn't know who was behind it all. They were just pawns in someone else's game. Frank slowly ran his fingers along his chin, considering his next move. "Hannah, you have one last chance," he said, twirling the knife in his fingers. "If I catch you lying again." "I don't know," she shouted. "I don't know his name. He just gave us instructions. Money. He promised money." "How much?" Frank pressed on. "5 million, she blurted out. "For your life." Frank froze. His heart beat faster, but his face remained stony. 5 million. For him. Someone had planned this a long time ago. Someone knew it would be difficult to pull off. And that someone had the resources. Frank walked over to the desk and pulled out his laptop. He needed more information. Opening the secure server, he began to review Hannah's financial transactions. If there was money, it had left a trail somewhere. 5 minutes. 10. And there it was. One large sum had been transferred from an offshore account to her personal account. Sender, unidentified. "Did you really think you could hide this?" Frank looked up. Hannah looked away. Her hands were shaking. She was no longer in control. "Who sent the money?" he asked. "I don't know. He just said it was an advance. That we'd get the rest after." She trailed off. "After what?" Frank pressed. "After you're gone," she whispered. Frank heard a sound from upstairs. Someone was in the house. He quickly turned off the basement light, took out his gun, and went upstairs. A silhouette with a flashlight moved slowly down the hallway. A stranger, armed. Frank moved silently, his every step precise. He waited for the moment when the stranger would pass by, and in one swift movement he pinned him against the wall, putting the gun to his temple. "Who sent you?" he hissed. "Let me go. You don't understand." The man gasped. Frank pressed harder on his neck. "Who?" "He's watching you. He knows you're here. And he won't stop until you're dead." Frank thought about it. This was more serious than he'd expected. He needed answers and he had to get them at any cost. The game wasn't over yet. It had only just begun. Frank didn't let go of the man, only tightened his grip on his neck. His eyes were cold, ruthless. "Who is he?" Frank asked, trying to read every micro-movement of the stranger's face. "I don't know. I'm just a contractor. He pays well. We were told you had to disappear." Frank realized instantly that this man wasn't lying. He was just a mercenary, another puppet in a big game. But if he was here, then there was someone else somewhere nearby. Suddenly there was a sound. A faint rustling that shouldn't have been in his house. Frank instantly threw the stranger to the floor, took out his gun and turned around sharply. And he was in time. Another silhouette emerged from the darkness. A shot. A bullet flew past his head, hit the wall. Frank responded instantly. 2 bullets, one in the shoulder, the other in the leg. The attacker fell, screaming in pain. "No more surprises," Frank hissed, approaching the wounded man. The stranger lay on the floor, clutching his wound. He was breathing heavily, but he could still speak. "What were you planning?" Frank pointed the gun directly at his head. You're already too late. He knows you're still alive. He'll send others." Frank felt adrenaline rush through his veins. They weren't just trying to eliminate him, they were really after him. He had to find out who was running this operation. "Name," he growled. The man flinched. He hesitated, but then he whispered, "He calls himself Lion." Frank repeated the name out loud. He didn't know it, but it was already burned into his memory. He would find this Lion. Frank knew he couldn't stay in the house. He had to seize the initiative. He returned to the basement, where Josh and Hannah were still tied up. "Did you know about Lion?" he asked. Hannah flinched, and Josh bowed his head guiltily. "He contacted us from an anonymous number," she said. "We didn't know who he was, only that he had power." "And you just agreed?" Frank couldn't help but feel bitterly ironic. "It was the only way," she shouted. "You were too strong, too dangerous. We could never walk away from you without consequences." Frank took a step closer. "And now? Do you realize that you've become targets yourself?" Hannah remained silent. Josh just stared guiltily at the floor. Frank knew his next move had to be calculated. His house was no longer safe. He needed to disappear. But before he left, he had to leave a trail. He took out his phone and sent copies of all the evidence to several different addresses. If anything went wrong, this data would end up in the right hands. Next up was the search for Lion. He wouldn't sit idly by. Now the hunt had begun. Frank set out into the night, leaving his old world behind. The game was no longer about defense. Now he was the hunter himself. Frank knew he had little time. He had to find Lion before he found him. Leaving the house, he quickly headed for his car, hidden in the garage of an old acquaintance. It was obvious that Lion had people already following him, so an open route was suicide. He took the longer route, changing 3 cars, going into the underground parking garages twice to make sure he wasn't being followed. Only when he reached a small motel on the outskirts of town did he allow himself a short break. Sitting down at his laptop, he began to gather information about Lion. Finding the information was difficult, but after several hours of searching, he had come across a lead. Lion was not just a mercenary. He was a shadowy figure working for criminal groups. He was not to be found just like that. But he knew one man who could help. Frank found the number of Sam, a former analyst who had been searching for secret individuals for the government. Sam was the only person Frank could trust. "Frank? Is that really you?" Sam seemed surprised. "I need information," Frank replied curtly. "I thought you had left the service. What's going on? They want to kill me. Or are they already looking for me? Is Lion's name enough to make you start digging?" There was silence on the other end. Then Sam exhaled. "I'll call you back in an hour. Stay where you are." Frank spent the next hour checking his weapons and analyzing his plan. He was no longer trapped. He was now the hunter. Suddenly the phone rang. "I have something," Sam said. "Lion works through a middleman. His name is Victor Kane. He controls all the deals with the hitmen in this area." "Where can I find him?" Frank asked. "He has an office in the Skull nightclub." "But Frank, it's a trap. They'll be waiting for you." Frank smiled. "Let them wait." The Skull Club was a place where the worst people in town gathered. Frank knew that going there was like entering the enemy's lair. But he wasn't afraid. He had a plan. Once inside, he looked around. Hundreds of people, loud music, cigarette smoke. Somewhere in the depths of the club was Victor Kane. Frank slipped past the security guards, approaching the VIP area. The guards quickly caught his attention, and one of them held out his hand, stopping him. "Sorry, buddy, you can't come in here." Frank took out his gun and replied quietly, "I'm not asking permission." He moved forward. There were several people inside the room. Victor was sitting at a table, calmly sipping his whiskey. He didn't look surprised to see Frank. "Well, the legendary negotiator himself," Kane smiled. "Why am I not surprised? Where is Lion?" Frank asked immediately. Kane leaned back and smiled. "Do you really think I'm going to tell you?" Frank wasted no time. He quickly pulled out a knife and plunged it into Kane's hand. "I'm not asking again." Kane screamed, but then laughed. Okay, he's not here, but he's looking for you, Frank. And when he finds you, there's nowhere for you to run." Frank leaned closer and whispered, "Then I'll find him first." The hunt continues. Frank left the Skull Club with the clear intention of finding Lion before he found him. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. Thanks to information he'd received from Victor Kane, he'd learned of a place where Lion might be hiding, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. When Frank arrived there, everything was quiet. Too quiet. He knew that Lion would not be alone. And as soon as he entered, everything was confirmed. He was expected. "Well, Frank?" Lion's voice cut through the darkness. "I knew you would come." Frank did not answer, only watched. There were 4 other armed men in the room, but he felt no fear. "You have disappointed me, Lion," Frank said. "This whole game, the conspiracy, the betrayal, you know I will not leave this unanswered." Lion smiled, but fear flashed in his eyes. "This is not a game, Frank. This is business. And you are simply on the wrong side." Frank abruptly drew his weapon and the shooting began. Blow after blow, bullet after bullet, he did not give them a chance. A few minutes passed, and only Lion remained. "Kill me if you want," he whispered, leaning against the wall, wounded but still alive. "But it won't change anything." Frank leaned closer. "You know what changes everything?" He looked straight into Lion's eyes. "Betrayal. It destroys everything: trust, love, life. You created this, now live with the consequences." Lion laughed softly, choking on blood. "You won't save yourself, Frank." Frank didn't listen. He knew this was the end. Frank left the warehouse, leaving behind the ruins of his past. He was no longer the man he had been. He knew that betrayal had its price, and all who committed it would pay sooner or later. Hannah and Josh? They would pay their price too. Not at his hands, but their lives would never be the same. They had betrayed, and betrayal always came back to haunt them. Frank disappeared into the darkness. He no longer sought the truth. He became the truth that everyone tried to escape from. Betrayal is not just a stab in the back. It is a poison that destroys everything around it. And if you have made it, be prepared for it to come back to you one day. Thank you very much for listening to this story to the end. I hope you liked. We work for you, looking for and telling you the most effective stories about women's betrayal, shocking intrigue, interweaving the plot and unexpected reactions of angry men. Save us, put likes, write comments, and, of course, subscribe to the channel to not miss any story.